Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Knicks Film School Preview Pod. My name is Andrew Claudio, a.k.a. GMAC, and once again, it is time for another season preview where we pick a different part of the Knicks roster, a strength of theirs that is allegedly one of the best in the NBA, and a different Knicks Film School faculty member will join me to see exactly where it stacks up against the rest of the NBA. Today, we're going to be looking at their wings, their wing depth that obviously got much stronger after a blockbuster trade with the Brooklyn Nets of all teams for Mikal Bridges. And joining me to break that all down, the detail junkie himself, Mr. DJ Zullo. DJ, how has your summer been, sir? How has your off season been?
It's been good. You know, it's where kids are back in school, so we're sort of back into the routine of things. So much so that I have been finding myself really itching for the season to start. What are we, 20 some odd days until preseason game number 1? So it's feels like it's right around the corner, but also like far away with training camp not even started yet. So doing this show and like sticking my teeth into this specific topic, which was a fun one, allowing me to maybe, let the time pass not so boringly and monotonously. So this has been good. Fun topic to break down. Happy to do it.
So Apple lets you on your iPhone create like a widget where you can put a countdown and you count down to specific dates. Usually I'll pick like a birthday or like my anniversary or a parent's birthday or a significant date. After which I guess I shouldn't have been looking forward to this. I put Jets opening night as my countdown after my birthday passed. And then the next date that I put down is October 6th, which is 24 days away from time of recording.
There we go.
Until the Knicks' first preseason game. So I'm with you as far as itching to get back into, maybe not necessarily into the swing of things as far as content is concerned, but I share your enthusiasm. And I think a lot of Knicks fans do that. This has a chance to be a very fun season. It has a chance to involve just as much winning as I can maybe remember, and obviously we'll get into why we think that could potentially be. But today we're going to talk about the wings, and let me just start here. Obviously, the cover art for this is going to have OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges. Am I forgetting someone in your calculation of the Knicks wings, or is that the duo we're going to focus on today?
It's a duo we're going to focus on, but when I started doing the exercise league wide, I started to realize there's a lot more teams with like 3 or 4 like high quality wing defenders, wing stoppers. So there's like there's an ability for the Knicks here to go 4 deep, especially like defensively on this team. Now there's clearly a top 2, but I think Josh Hart is like as a third banana in this is like really high level, and then DiVincenzo as well. Although we can get into sort of the details about like, what makes a wing defender, what positions are you comfortable guarding? DiVincenzo probably more of like a 1-2 defender, not really able to guard up the line. So that's like a differentiatory aspect to this. But, the Knicks go about 4 deep of really high quality wing defenders. There's a clear top 2, and those are they're the reason why we're doing this specific show and why they rank so high.
I'm going to use a baseball analogy, but it's not a perfect 1-to-1. But like, remember when the Yankees had Jason Giambi? They signed him in 2002, and it was like, oh my God, they got this big slugger to sit in the middle of the lineup, and he stood out as a very high profile run producer for that team. And then they lost that first year, and they fell short. Won 100 games, but they fell short. And it was like, you need better bats in the lineup. And then 2 years later, you have Matsui, you have Gary Sheffield, you have A-Rod in the lineup, and then suddenly Jason Giambi is your 6 hitter. And it's like, oh my gosh, look at the embarrassment of riches with Jason Giambi, one of the better power hitters in baseball, now hitting 6th in your lineup.
Well, it was like, in 2006 with the Mets, it didn't end up working out this way, but Cliff Lloyd has the big 2005, and you thought, wow, he's going to be like our 6th hitter now. And he had some injuries, didn't perform so well, but that's sort of the idea here, where you now feel much better about a guy that was your cleanup of one of your best hitters is now like hitting down in your lineup. So I totally get that. I think that's where the Knicks are and where some of these other teams are in terms of the depth of their wings.
Two things. One, that is a much better comparison with Josh Hart to Cliff Floyd, in that a guy that probably was more qualified to be a 6-hitter, hitting behind Beltran, hitting behind Wright, hitting behind what the Mets had, Delgado hitting ahead of him. And the second thing, what a start to this podcast that I'm using the Yankee analogy and I get corrected with a better Mets analogy. So thank you for that, DJ.
Yes, you're welcome.
Look, I think this league going more toward a focus on the perimeter, just for perimeter scoring, the high emphasis on 3-point shooting over the last decade or so. I mean, having two of the best or better wing duos, wing perimeter defenders, it's just going to be a weapon. And just like to add another out of sport concept or example, you know, if you take a really great defensive football coach and you give him like a pass rusher that's elite, that's going to lead to success. Well, then if you also add a second pass rusher that's just as elite and put him on the other edge, you're looking at potentially one of the better defenses in football. Obviously, there's not a one-to-one comparison with how impact football is to what a wing can do, but just how lethal, how dangerous can this wing duo be, in your opinion?
Well, I think they complement each other so well, because I think where the Knicks lacked even after acquiring Anunoby is that, you know, when they lost Grimes, they really didn't have a great replacement guarding the point of attack against smaller guards. Anunoby could do it, but you saw limitations with, you know, screen navigation and really sort of choking off angles with guards that are really bursty. Maxey being, you know, one. I think even with guards like Lillard and Halliburton, where he can do the job, but it's probably not where you want Anunoby's greatness to really shine. You want him in more of a isolation, help, nail defender, low man defender. I think that's where he's at his best. So you get a guy like Bridges, who I think is one of the better point of attack defenders against small guards in the NBA. It's what Phoenix asked him to do primarily during their championship, their finals run, and years before and after that. He was the guy that they would have guard the smaller, quicker, electric point of attack or guards in the NBA. He would do it really well. Screen navigation, his ability to get skinny around those screens, and then obviously his ability to guard in isolation is high level, maybe not the quality as some of the guys we'll talk about today at the top end, but he's certainly excellent at doing that, and just a very good awareness defender, off-ball defender, does all the things, always in the right spot. He doesn't foul, which is another underrated aspect to his game, is that he averages, I think, under 3 fouls per game. For a guy that plays a lot of minutes, who plays aggressively, it's a phenomenal trait to have. So they just complement each other really well. And the Knicks, when they lost Grimes, didn't have a replacement in-house. So to get that guy is going to allow Anunoby to really be, and I think you could see a defensive player of the year run for Anunoby specifically. I think that's in the cards this year, based on how the Knicks are going to use him and the value that the narrative going into the year is already going to be pretty high, that Anunoby, based on what he did last year, the value he brings to the Knicks as a defender. I think Bridges is really going to do a great job of allowing Anunoby to be his best self, which is going to make the Knicks defense arguably their best at their best. Excuse me.
So to the point you're making, that whole thing you just said was about their defense, and that, to emphasize to people, is what we're going to focus on today. So how they perform offensively doesn't factor in. Like, this isn't a Kawhi Leonard, Paul George conversation, although that was one of the better defensive wing duos maybe ever. But like, the fact that they're also 25 point per game scorers doesn't factor into this conversation. So when we get to what our top fives are potentially, we're really just talking about their defense and who they stack up against and how often they're going to be able to be used and utilized as a weapon against the contenders in the Eastern Conference, which I just want to pick your brain on that. Cause like I did the over-unders with John. I have the over on the Knicks this year. I talked to Mensa last week, the eternal potence of positivity, and I love it. And he had the Knicks as the best starting five in the NBA, and I'm all for it, even if I do disagree.
Spicy,
with it. Right? Like I'm all for it. I believe in this team just as much. Yes, but in your honest, unbiased opinion, like we've heard, and I've maybe even said, like how well they stack up against Boston now, like. What are the other teams that they also stack up well against, if Boston's one of them, with this being led by the defensive wing duo of Anunoby and Bridges?
Sure. So just to stick with the Eastern Conference to kick us off, I think when you have a guard that is smaller, that is really dynamic, I think that is where my brain is going first. So that's Donovan Mitchell. So it's Cleveland. That's Dame Lillard, Milwaukee. I think Halliburton falls into this as well because of how dynamic he is as a playmaker. I think Philadelphia is another one with Maxey. I think if you look at teams with smaller guards that the Knicks are now going to have a really nice matchup for, I think as a whole, that's going to allow them to really be a high level defense team against those rosters, despite potential issues with size, which I know we're going to get into. So there are teams that if Mitchell Robinson is hurt or he's in foul trouble, and the Knicks have an Achua, Sims front line or starting center and a backup, and maybe some Anunoby backup five, I think you're going to see maybe some issues on the defensive backboards and maybe some defensive slippage. But when you have good, high quality guards, you need to be able to guard the point of attack. That when you are getting beat constantly, it just, as Benji likes to talk about, you get put in the blender often. And that's what, to me, the biggest issue was in the playoffs last year when this team wasn't performing at their best on the defensive end. It was their struggle guarding the ball. And then it's, paint touch, kick out, close out, another paint touch, kick out, close out, and then you get a layup or you get an open three, and you're just in a lot of trouble. So to be able to shore up that end is going to do wonders for this team. So I think for any team that in the Eastern Conference, and there's a lot of them that present a really tough on ball, high level scoring guard that can pull up from three. So you're going to have to really get over the top of those screens. The Knicks, I think, match up well with those teams. Now there's teams out West that are just bigger and brawnier, and that I think could give the Knicks some problems. I mean, Denver is one. I think the Lakers is another. I think potentially Oklahoma City, depending on how Chet is in terms of his offseason program, and the Isaiah Hartenstein addition, as we all know, and Jalen Williams is a big-bodied wing power forward type. So I think there's teams in the West that can potentially, in Minnesota, that can give the Knicks some problems. But that's, to me, that's less of a concern. In the East, I feel like this roster, Boston included, I think the Knicks have built a roster to really compete on the defensive end. So I can probably squint and say, yeah, maybe Orlando, if Paolo takes a big lead, that's a big, strong team that can maybe give the Knicks some problems. But I'm not there at this point. So I think the Knicks in general match up well with any team in the Eastern Conference. There's some teams in the West that are just give them issues because of how big they are. But to me, if you're getting to the finals, you have that question and that concern then. You're only playing these teams twice a year. Bigger concern is the East, and the Knicks, I think, do a good job of matching up.
One follow-up on behalf of my PTSD. I thought about Miami when I sent you that question, that they could potentially pose a problem. Now,
what are you thinking?
I have no idea what to expect from Miami. As much as I joke around about where they're going to find their next undrafted superstar, I just don't know what to expect from a team that has consistently told you the regular season is not something we're taking seriously. Right. And so maybe it's a playoff question. If you have Anunoby and Bridges against Jimmy Butler in Jimmy Butler mode, how much should I fear Miami in that sense? That there's really no lead guard that you have to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, Rozier can go off in a game or two, but not someone that you're really concerned about. Right. To me, it's always been the Miami system disrupts things. Jimmy Butler's interesting because I think it's clear there's been some slippage in his athleticism. There's been an increased reliance on free throws. So if you're going to say Anunoby and Bridges are pretty disciplined defenders, it's going to, I think, limit in a Knicks matchup some easy buckets or easy points that Butler would just get. You remember in the playoffs how many times he would steal Grimes under the basket, or even Josh Hart, and just overpower them and get to the free throw line or get a layup. Those are plays that bigger, longer defenders are just going to limit. Anunoby and Bridges are going to do those things. So listen, I'm with you in the general sense that Miami is always a threat until proven otherwise. I just don't think that they present problems for the Knicks wing duos in the same way some of these other teams could potentially, because of just the way that the Miami Heat are set up currently. In that, I think this is going to be the year we look at Jimmy Butler and all right, he's maybe slipped out of that all-star level. He's a really good player still, but just a guy that in his certainly he's getting close to his mid-30s, a lot of miles, some injuries. So I just don't know if he's at that same level to where it's going to strike fear into the Knicks. To me, the Miami Heat are more of like the system, the coach, Bam, his defense, and then what they can do as a defensive team. More so, how fearful you would be of their offense and their scoring ability.
So it's Heat culture is the justified fear that I have of them. Is
and I think it's legit. Yeah, I think it's a fair. I mean, it's a real thing. Even if the Heat themselves take it a little too far, it's a real thing.
I hope we don't hear from that this year, is what I'll say. I hope that this is play-in mode for the Heat again, and that the Knicks are so high up that we don't have to necessarily worry about them. You did hit on what my suspicions were, is that this wing duo. Like even if I wanted to throw Paul George into the mix of like, they match up well in like a matchup with the Sixers because of what they can. They have a look for Paul George. If they switch, they have a look for Maxey. Even like we saw them switch between Precious and Anunoby against Embiid in the playoffs. Also saw Mitch guard Embiid really well throughout that entire
he was
series.
incredible. Yeah.
So like they actually do have good looks for Philly. And obviously with Boston, the whole conversation after they made the trade for Bridges was like, oh, they have two elite wing defenders that can not take down, but match up against Boston's two elite wing offensive players. Milwaukee's the interesting team because I've had people tell me in the past Anunoby has given Giannis problems. I would argue not many teams have given Giannis that many problems in the past.
Yeah. Second half of that game, tail end of last year, like in the second half especially, Anunoby did a good job, but it's Giannis when he's going, I think this is where you're going with this. When he's getting downhill, there's two or three guys in the sport that can physically match up with it. And I just think Anunoby is just giving up a little too much size strength in that particular matchup.
So where I'm going to with Milwaukee is that after the over under pod, I mentioned that I have the over. John mentioned he had the over. You brought up the Darko DPM stat on social media that there's an indication based off of their declining impact from two of their core players, both Dame and Brook Lopez, that their age might catch up to them. That this year might actually be the year to take the under. I mean, just from a Knicks matchup standpoint, because it's actually an angle I didn't even consider, that like Father Time's undefeated. And while I think that's more of a playoff concern, we'll see if they can hold up during the regular season. So just from a Milwaukee standpoint, how do Anunoby and Bridges make a difference, if at all, in a series against Milwaukee or a match against Milwaukee?
Well, I think you're right. It's a really interesting one. I mentioned the Bridges Dame matchup, which I think is a good one for the Knicks. As much as you're going to guard a guy like Lillard, I think Bridges is one of the better options against him. Where I think the matchup really goes better for the Knicks is that if you go small and Anunoby is basically your five, then you have an ability to handle some of the Brook Lopez like screen and pop and recover. It was always like Mitch, he would do a good job of initially containing the guard in that matchup. It's the recovery out to Lopez that would always present the biggest problem. I think Anunoby is more equipped for his agility and his quickness to be able to handle that. So you potentially could have, by necessity, a more versatile defensive lineup that can handle some of the Milwaukee like stretch five things that has really given the Knicks a lot of problems. The Giannis factor is interesting because I think for him, it's always like if he's getting downhill and he's sort of getting the runway, I just don't think there's, and this I'll include Randall in this conversation as well. I don't think there's guys that can match up on a physical side with him, but I think the Knicks can slow down Lillard. They have a guy, if you wanted to have whether it's Hart or DiVincenzo, like maybe make things a little harder on Middleton, and then Anunoby as a sort of like wherever you need him to go, Swiss Army knife type defender. That's where I think the Knicks can really do a good job, and that Swiss Army knife sort of aspect to this thing, as we look at some of these other wing duos in the league, like that part to me was where I would edge guy a little bit higher, because if you can guard like 1 through 4, maybe even 1 through 5, and like be a versatile defender, multiple different defensive roles, I'm going to bump you up a little higher than a guy that can maybe be a great isolation defender against wings, but struggle as a low man or struggle in help, like things of that nature. Anunoby, I think, in his greatness is the versatility. And against Milwaukee, that's paramount.
Okay. Well, I think we're at the point where I can now ask you what your list is. And actually, last thing before we get, I actually want to know historically, not necessarily where the Knicks rank, but some of the better wing duos that, I mean, you're a basketball historian, like I can be sometimes. Like when you think about defensive wing duos, like how far back would you go to be like, oh, I start here and then I think about this group? I gotta be honest, I think more of specific wing defenders like Scottie Pippen or Bruce Bowen, Alex Roberson. Remember him from the Thunder days? Like I go back to specific ones. I've actually never thought of like who, like the tag team partner, who was Batman, who was Robin, or Captain America and Tony Stark, whichever reference makes sense to the younger kids, you know? And
there's plenty that had the one guy, but it's when you talk about a duo, the list is actually shorter than you think. I mean, the first one that comes to mind, I didn't watch them live, but you're just reading about them and watching like historical games, is like the Michael Cooper, Byron Scott Lakers in the 80s is like the first like elite wing duo type. And then I think you can probably go like in the 80s, you know, maybe like Dumars and Rodman are interesting because I think Dumars' defense is historically underrated, and Rodman was like, in terms of like, I talk about Swiss Army knife and versatility. In Detroit, he would guard every position. So I think if you look at that Detroit team, they're not known necessarily as having wing stoppers, but I think Dumars and Rodman were excellent. And then you already touched on them. I think Pippen and Jordan are like, if you were going to come up with like the poster child for like the great wing tag team, I think you have to start with the Bulls, Jordan and Pippen, because of just how elite they were, how versatile they were, how well they played off each other. You know, the Pippen stifling things in Jordan in the passing lane and vice versa, the abilities for one of them. And we saw that in the finals when Jordan stole the ball from Malone, where he's basically roving and it wasn't a called defensive play. He just sort of stopped. And he when you have a guy like Pippen, you know, you're covered on the back end. I think those guys are probably, you know, the best wing duo, if you're going to like historically in the history of the NBA. And then what was interesting is I just went like pace of space era, like 2007, like right when like D'Antoni came in and up to like present day. I think when the first like 2008 through like 2013, most teams had one. Rarely did they have two. And then you could even go like the Mavericks in 2012 was interesting because Shawn Marion, that is, maybe could have been deemed the wing stopper, but he was sort of like at post peak, and Deshaun Stevenson was solid, but that team probably didn't have a single wing stopper. San Antonio, you mentioned Bruce Bowen as like the one guy. So plenty of teams had one wing stopper. It's not until like the modern game of like post Golden State Warriors, Steph Curry, where teams now are stacking up 2, 3, sometimes 4 wing stoppers. So there's that part of it. And then specifically to the Knicks, you just think back to the 90s and through the Van Gundy years, they really didn't have your classic wing stopper. They had good defenders, but it was more Ewing at the start, good team principles, good team defenders. Sprewell had a decent run. I would not call him a wing stopper. So the Knicks really haven't had, even the 12-13 team, Shumpert, good defender, but I wouldn't call him a wing stopper. And then through like the We Here year, Reggie Bullock, good, solid defender, 22-23 season. Grimes, I don't necessarily call him a wing stopper because he lacked the versatility up the line, guarding 4s. We know he couldn't guard 5s. So it's not till this year where the Knicks finally have like 2 guys at that level. There's many years where the Knicks would have great defenses and not have a single classic wing stopper. So that's just like an interesting, like in terms of their franchise, the Knicks are at an interesting place because it's always been something I've had a lot of fascination in terms of watching these players. So for me as a fan, it's going to be a blast to be able to watch 2 guys that have, you know, been in conversation for all defensive teams. I mean, it's not something that historically this franchise has had a lot of.
Well, something that's been a common thread throughout a lot of the teams that you mentioned was that with your potential wing lead defender, there's usually an elite rim protector as well. You know, you go to those Lakers teams, obviously Kareem is part of it. Right. The Bulls really didn't. it was like a combination of Luke Longley and
Bill Weddington.
Yeah, Weddington. Yeah, like you go back then but like then you go to Bruce Bowen and it's like, we're Tim Duncan and David Robinson and were those guys around. I think the fascinating part, like the ones that I would mention would be like Iguodala and Clay or Draymond, and the ones that are able to guard 1 through 4. Right. Or I guess in Draymond's case, 1 through 5. I thought about LeBron and either Shane Battier or really not Wade, because Wade was never known for his defense, but when he locked in, he could. But pair LeBron with Iman Shumpert when he played for the Cavaliers. So like there are specific lineups you could throw to. I'm glad you threw out the Rodman, Joe Dumars mention. I remember during the pandemic when there was nothing to watch and The Last Dance was like the main form of content. They actually have the full basketball games available on YouTube, or at least did back then. And I watched some of the series where Pippen got the migraines. And in that game 7, Pippen was a non-factor and it was like evident from the beginning. But Rodman is like, I'm going to go guard Michael Jordan. I'm going to go on this next possession. I'm guarding Horace Grant. And what he was is a weapon. That was the year he won Defensive Player of the Year. It's good to sometimes as a basketball fan to go back and inform yourself of what these guys were before they became personalities. Like Barkley and Shaq are probably the biggest ones when we speak so glowingly about their playing days. And it's like, the morons from inside the NBA? What are you talking about? Yes, Dennis Rodman, the eclectic personality that for a time we thought was going to be the ambassador to go meet with King Jong-un all the time. Right. He was one of the best defenders and rebounders maybe ever. So like, there's that part of it too.
Sure. And he had basically 2 careers where Detroit, as we talked about, like defense and the versatility. And then he goes and he becomes the greatest rebounder in the history of the NBA, and obviously at that age that he didn't have the defensive versatility, but also a guy that would guard Shaq as well as anyone in the league, gave Alonzo Mourning fits every time he would guard him, like an absolute fascinating defensive player, one of the best ever. So he was great. And I do want to just point out a couple other teams that I remember, more recent teams that had really great defensive duo depth. The Toronto team 2019, obviously you start with Kawhi, but you have Danny Green on that team as well. So those 2 would be like, you had to make a list of best wing duos from championship teams, like they would be pretty high on that list. And then, the next year, obviously the Lakers win it. And then Danny Green he's on the Lakers, and you have KCP, you have Caruso on that team who didn't have play a ton of minutes, but another really impressive like trio in that regard. And then obviously LeBron is on that team as well. And you really teams start to build out like multiple wing stoppers, not just like a handful or 1 or 2. You have now 3 or 4 on rosters pretty consistently nowadays, which is, when you start eliminating some of the centers that are not playing as much, or smaller point guards that can't shoot or that were pass first, like those guys are kind of being phased out. The rugged power forwards being phased out, and they're being phased out for the most part, versatile, athletic wings that you just hope can learn enough skill to go along with like some high defensive ability. That's why you have so many of them right now. It's where the league is going. And right now it's probably at its apex, and I just don't see it regressing. I think this is going to keep moving northward in terms of like the defensive talent in this league right now.
Well, defensively, and look, obviously there's a death lineup or a lineup where the Knicks can go small that a lot of people have pointed to. I'm not going to bring up that lineup today. What I will say is defensively, remember when we were on playback last year and someone asked us, what's the Knicks' best defensive 5 that they could put out there? And we were like, obviously, like Brunson's not part of that. And if they wanted to do it, like Deuce at the 1, and then maybe DiVincenzo with Hart, Anunoby, and either Hartenstein or Mitch, probably Hartenstein with the season he had last year. There's a lineup they can go to, like whether it's a switch everything 1 through 5, or it's like a 1 through. What the Celtics alternate between this? Either it's called 15 or 14, where the 14 is just you switch 1 through 4, and then Porzingis plays a drop, or the 15 is you switch everything 1 through 5 with Horford on the court. there's a world where the Knicks can switch 1 through 5 if Precious is your 5, and you have Josh Hart and Bridges and Anunoby and McBride, or you switch 1 through 4 and play Mitch and drop, and it's a pretty effective defensive lineup. I have no idea how many points that lineup is going to score, but defensively, they have a lot of looks they can go to that is going to be pretty elite, if you ask me.
Yeah, and then maybe you get a situation where, and we know the Celtics do this a ton, where you have Mitch guard the worst wing offensive player on the other team, and just if that player is sticking in the corner and not a huge shooting threat, have Mitch be a roamer and really like switch everything outside of Mitch being in that specific role. So hope Tibbs is prepared. I think he will be to be a little more creative this year, because I just think the team calls for it now.
I think if there was ever a roster that he would be like licking his chops, like staying up late, like the Birdman meme, rubbing his hands together, like, oh my gosh, I have so much defensive talent. I can't wait. This is the roster he's going to do it with. Okay. So best wing duos in the NBA. I want to give a shout out to just flat out another person I work with and another show that I produce, Mr. Fred Katz of Katz and Shoot, who actually had this as a topic of conversation with Jared Weiss of The Athletic, as well, his colleague at The Athletic, who covers the Celtics, earlier in the summer. And I went back and listened to that episode just to make sure I didn't forget anybody. And while my list may be more informed from theirs, I actually am curious where DJ goes with his. So I will give you start with number 5, your number 5 best wing duo in the NBA.
Now you're saying duo. I focus on the defensive end. This is defensive duos. So that caveat is very important when you start hearing the names, specifically at number 5. So this might surprise some, but the Atlanta Hawks, Dyson Daniels, Jalen Johnson. I think I've said this. I think Daniels has as much defensive talent at the point of attack as any single player in the NBA right now. I think he is potentially one of the best individual defenders in the NBA. Young, but his tape is incredible. Some of the impact metrics are catching up to him. And I think Jalen Johnson we talked about already that this might be at least my theme of the pod in terms of a phrase, Swiss Army knife, can guard 2 through 5, probably. Good rebounder, which is an important factor here. Defensive playmaker, solid on the ball. Probably is, if you remember him against the Knicks last year, at least at that point, physically, strength wise, probably gave up a little bit too much in some matchups. But again, you would probably project a little more growth in that area in the strength department. I think this team probably is going to, and I had them 3rd last year and they burned me, but I think they're probably going to surprise more people than you think in terms of their overall win total. But I think it starts with those 2 guys on the defensive end. I think they're phenomenal, and that's why I have them starting us off at number 5.
Over under 37.5 wins.
I'm going over. I think 41, 42 is probably where they're going to be.
Someone has to be the 9th seed. Someone has to be the 8th seed. I feel you. I took the over too with that concept in mind. Someone has to replace Chicago in the calculation, or we'll see. Maybe Miami really takes the regular season unseriously. You're number 4.
Number 4. So here's where I think I took a little liberty in this sense, where they had a 3rd guy that I just had to boost them up because of it. I had trouble just picking 2 of them. And it's the Minnesota Timberwolves, because McDaniels is one of the best defenders in the NBA, and then you have 2 guys in Walker, Alexander and
Alexander Walker.
Excuse me, thank you, and Edwards, where I think those 3 are as maybe they're not like at the highest level at where some of these other teams are, but I think if you factor in those 3. That's where I think they really jump up a little bit higher. I think all 3 of them are high level defensive players. They have certain traits, like Edwards' his playmaking is just otherworldly athleticism. McDaniels as an isolation defender is as good as it comes. Obviously fouls too much, so he's gonna have to figure that part out. But Alexander Walker has just been, ever since he came into the league, just been a solid defender. You look at some of his impact metrics, always been really highly regarded in that area. So I think Minnesota, their defense with Gobert and their size and strength obviously is going to be the thing you start with. But to me, like what they could do defensively at the wing position is one of the main reasons why, even if Gobert slips even more on where he is as a defender, they're going to be more than okay in large part because of like their wing depth and the quality of that depth.
So I need to turn to Scott Foster here or Dick Bavetta and get an official pick from you. Is it who you're putting with McDaniels?
Ooh,
if you have to pick one.
Man, I'll go Alexander Walker, but it's tough. I think
duos. I would pick them. I would pick them too. It's not a knock on Ant. He's everything you said he is. Those were the two that I wrote down as part of this exercise. All right, you're number 3.
Number 3 is the New York Knicks.
Okay, they are the third best wing duo in the NBA, according to DJ. Go ahead, make the case.
Again, defensive end we're talking about, and I think because as I hate to repeat myself, but it's where they complement each other is probably the best case right now for where the Knicks are for those two guys on the defensive end. I think I would just caution Knicks fans a little bit in terms of like expecting Bridges to be this mauling defensive player that's going to like really suppress shots and shut down players. He's more of on the edges. He makes everything just a little bit tougher in almost every single area. And it's like contesting with the left hand against a right hand shooter. It's having his contest hand up ready to go before the player gets into his release. So he's right away. He's seeing a visual obstacle to the rim, like those things over a course of a season, and he doesn't miss games, and he plays a lot of minutes. Like those add up to where, as a team defense, you're just gonna be better with him on the court. And then Anunoby, as I already talked about, I think is going to be in the conversation for best defensive player in the league this year because of his versatility. He can guard really well 2 through 5 against most 5s. He can guard most 1s. He can guard. There's some 1s and some 5s where it's just too much to ask. But in terms of versatility, there's just not many guys ahead of him. He's as good as it gets in that area. And isolation defense sometimes gets talked about too much, but I think where the league is right now, there's so many creative ways for coaches now to get players into space in isolation that you really need to be able to handle those possessions and hold up well, suppress shots, contest shots, force mid-rangers instead of layups, all things that Anunoby is really adept at. So that's where I have the Knicks. I think there's a couple teams a little better than them, but you can easily make the argument that the Knicks they have a great argument for being number 1. I just have them at number 3.
So I'm going to just tease my list a little bit. I'm a homer first and foremost. So the Knicks were my number 1, Anunoby and Bridges, but I had 2 other wing duos that I was like, if you put them at number 1, I'd understand. And I say that because I'm very curious if they're the same 2 that you have at 1 and 2. So then, okay. DJ, your number 2 best wing duo in the NBA.
At number 2, I have the Boston Celtics.
So which 2?
Yeah. So now listen, this is where like things can be a little fluid and you can maybe talk me into doing a little flip flop here. But when I initially made the list, I did probably price in the depth of the Celtics wing defensive roster versus the high end 2 guys. Now, I have Drew Holiday as a wing in this case, and here's where I sort of differentiate that. And I'll compare him to like Jalen Suggs, just to use another player. Suggs, I think, is a great defender, but I feel like he's a point guard, shooting guard defender. Can probably guard up a little bit, but that's just not where his strength is. His strength is elite ball pressure, playmaker. But in the end, he's 6'2", so it's a limiting factor. Drew, and we saw this opening night last year, guarded Julius Randle, gave him fits, can guard any position on the court. I think there's some centers that you can probably put him on and just be okay with it.
The few times that they played the Sixers last year, he was guarding Embiid for a possession at a time. So, and that's part of their switch everything. Their ability to put him on centers is, that it's a weapon. So I agree.
It's a huge weapon. He's incredibly strong. He's incredibly disciplined. We'll get to another guy next that is probably his contemporary in terms of like a smaller defender, but ability to guard the entire lineup is just phenomenal. So he's incredible. So I'm going to have him as one. And then I'm going to put Tatum as the second guy.
Ooh.
Although you can easily argue Derek White. Maybe you can argue Jaylen Brown as well. I think White and Tatum are probably where you would have to pick from. The reason I'll take Tatum is that if you remember last year, how often he would guard centers and how well he would do in those matchups. Now, I don't think he is a guy you want to put on smaller guards. I think he's probably not equipped to handle that agility wise and screen navigation, probably a little bit too much of an ask for him. But guarding 2 through 5, I think he is supremely underrated. And you can make a great argument for Derek White as a, weak side shot blocker, chase down shot blocker, just a playmaking guard. He's right there. And I am splitting hairs with taking one over the other. And I just want to reiterate, when I made Boston my number 2, I was factoring in the kind of the group more than the duo.
The depth,
but the depth of like how good they are. I think if you can take either one, I think Tatum is integral to how they play defense. I think his importance as a guy that can guard bigs is huge. Not a great playmaker, but again, just solid, big enough body to where like he knows angles, gets in the way. You're not going to physically abuse him at this stage of his career. Really important to what they do. And I don't think they're as elite a defensive team without any of these guys, but I feel like Tatum's role in that consistently year after year gets underrated. I think he's a really excellent defensive player. I know some of the impact metrics, if you're looking at it in that regard, you probably have to take White. I think Tatum's size, length, huge for where the Celtics are. And I think Drew's ability as a defender is goes without saying. So I think I have those two guys as number 2. But I think you can make a great case for the Knicks to be a little bit ahead of them because of how good the Knicks 2 guys are. But it's an interesting conversation. Did you have Boston 2?
So what I did was, I had Boston 3, but it was like, to your point about their depth is like, I had both duos written down. So I would have White and Holiday, and then I had Brown and Tatum next to each other. Yeah. And it was like, I'm just going to put the number 3 next to both. So it covers up 2 lines, right? Because that depth to what you're speaking of, they have 4 very good defensive wings that switch a lot. And it's why they became such a weapon throughout a historic regular season. Mm-hmm. I think the best argument outside of the depth for what you're making is at them ahead of the Knicks is if we were doing a draft, who's the first pick of all of the defenders? Like, I probably think Drew Holiday at this point, right?
Oof.
Or would you go Anunoby?
I probably would go Anunoby, to be honest with you. And I might be arguing against myself here.
So I will give you a mulligan if you want. Do you want to swap the Knicks and the Celtics?
You give me a mulligan.
Yeah.
I'll take the mulligan. I'll take the mulligan. Put the Knicks in number 2. If this was the whole group, I think I'd be comfortable with where the Celtics pick was in number 2, but I have to take 2. You're being a stickler here. So
yeah,
that's the rule. Give me flip them.
Okay, there you go. 2. The Celtics, you have been bumped behind the Knicks, which will be a theme for this season, by the way.
Yeah. Harbinger of things to come. Let's go.
Exactly. So you're number 1. I think I know, but I wonder if it's the same as my number 2.
Is it the Oklahoma City Thunder?
No. Oh, this is going to be fun. Okay. So they're my number 4.
You're number 4. Okay.
Which 2 wings did you go with for the Thunder?
I went with Caruso and I went with Dort.
Yeah, those are my 2.
I think Caruso does a lot of the similar things, maybe not guard quite up the line like Drew Holiday can, but I think Caruso is actually a little better guarding smaller guards, and I think his agility is a little better. great like slap down block guy, steal guy, like the Carmelo block where you just, it's like a steal block type thing. Like he's excellent at that. He's one of the few guys in the NBA where if he's giving you his top foot, and most offensive players are trained like attack the top foot, like go that direction. And most defenders will then open their hip up to where like you're now getting a lane to the rim because it's just a natural reaction to open your hips, where Caruso, and Holiday does this as well, will actually slide in the direction of where his top foot is, cut off that drive where the defender hits his chest, and then he swipes down, gets a steal in many of those occasions. Like it's one of the classic, like elite defensive player traits. Only a few guys are really equipped to do. Caruso does it as well as anyone. And then Dort, although, and I think this is a little underrated. This was the Pat Beverly thing where his defensive value was probably overstated because he fouled so much. I think Dort sort of like falls into this a little bit, but he is such a, he's like a bull and a pest at like the same time, where he's just like in your stuff every single minute, every single game, and just makes things uncomfortable. I think he guards Luka as well as any player in the NBA. His strength and his agility, like that combination, like there's just not a lot of guys that can do those things, like slide and also use like a bowling ball, a barrel chest to knock you off your spot. In terms of like shot blocking, defensive playmaking, probably not like as great as you hope for like a classic like wing stopper, but he is just so good at making things difficult for you that I have to put him as one of the best on-ball defenders. And you just combine him with what Caruso has done his entire career. Like that's why I had them number one. And then I know this isn't going to be a factor. Those are my two guys, but I think Jalen Williams has a potential to not quite be a wing stopper, but be a high quality wing defender, which is going to make them just an absolute beast to try to score against. So yeah, the Oklahoma City Thunder, I mean, they're going to have an incredible defensive season. Hartenstein, as we all know, and the continued development of Chet, and as a weak side shot blocker, like playing that Giannis role. And then Dort and Caruso, just incredible. I think Wallace is actually a really good defender as a young player. Just a ton of defensive talent, but Caruso and Dort, I had those guys number one.
So it's interesting. We're 47 minutes into this podcast, about to be 48-ish. And I'm already rethinking, should I have asked you instead of wing duos or wings in general, should we just done like best defensive rosters? Because I think that might make up a better conversation. Although I think it's spoken to what the Knicks' strength is. And that's where Oklahoma City's strength, like you, it seems like the theme is you went with the wing depth. And that depth will translate into what one of the Thunder's strength this year, right?
I mean, you have to have like the top end talent, and like even if Josh Hart is like a part of that, and DiVincenzo, like it's the two guys that really puts them in that conversation. Like Jalen Williams is a high quality defensive player, but it's Dort and Caruso. Drew Holiday makes the Celtics, like he's the most important defender in my opinion on their team, and either you can put any of those other guys in there, and you would lose a lot if you lost him or White or Tatum. So I think it is important to have like the two guys, and some teams are just lucky enough to have like another a third or a fourth guy that are really high quality, and that just makes for an interesting conversation. But I think it's still to have two wing defenders for even just to back you up for injuries, or having a rotation where you have one off the floor. It's really important. So. No, I think it's a very valuable way of looking at it. And then like you go back to, as we did to go back in history, and like most teams just had the single guy, or some teams didn't have any of them. And just so you can really see how the league has evolved on the defensive end.
So we did have 4 matches, I will say. I also had Caruso and Dort on my list. I had him at number 4. I had picked 2 Celtics, so I did pick Holiday and White as my number 3. Obviously, the Knicks main duo is my number 1. I didn't have the 2 Hawks on my top 5. I did have McDaniels and Nickeil Alexander-Walker as my number 5. So my number 2, I want to get your thoughts on. I have Herb Jones and Trey Murphy III. So your thoughts
they were 6.
on those 3. So they're numbers. So we're right.
They're like an honorable mention.
We're nearly an ox step. Okay.
Yeah. Herb Jones, he is as good as it gets, right? Mm-hmm. And the problem I ran into when I was like, I really wrestled with that duo. I didn't think I had enough confidence in Murphy to like put him in that mix. Now you can argue that Jones is so good that if Murphy the third is like a B- B defender, and Herb is like an A+ potentially, like that might be good enough to be in your top five. That's completely reasonable, and why I really heavily consider them. But I thought like the balance of the two guys, I probably weighed that a little bit more, and like the other teams where I thought I wanted like two at least A- defenders, where I think Murphy the third is right now, like can get there because his length and size is like really good. Just I haven't seen it yet. Not to say he can't get there, just hasn't been there yet to date.
I think to your theme about Dyson Daniels, like maybe if he and although Dyson Daniels is more of and he's a shooting guard, like he would qualify if he and Herb Jones were available. They probably make your list.
They absolutely would have made the list. Yep.
Yeah, Herb Jones, to your point, it's been from day one that you just like that playoff series where he was taking turns guarding Chris Paul, Booker, and Ayton was like, wait a minute, what is this? And I've not turn this into a Pelicans podcast. I have no idea how to evaluate them. They went out and got DeJounte Murray. I'd like to see Trey Murphy start this season, and they probably
I think they do too.
Well, so whatever happens with Brandon Ingram and Zion, and whether they get a clean bill of health, I'm sure they'll get a lot of Trey Murphy minutes this season. But man, I just don't know what to make of that team, where I think two of their most impactful players will be looked over or passed over for guys with more established careers. But yeah, it's largely a conversation about Herb Jones for me. If you told me he was a defensive player of the year at the end of the year, I'd be shocked, because it means Wemby didn't win, and right now he's the very heavy favorite. But yeah, so all right, so we're largely in lockstep on top 5, top 6. I like it, DJ. I like when not necessarily when we agree, because I do like that, but when I am in the same perspective and thinking as one of the people that who's a basketball opinion I respect the most.
It goes both ways,
Well, thank you.
It goes both ways. Yes.
Thank you, DJ. So last thoughts before we get out of here. Just your excitement for the upcoming Knicks season. You want to speak to it before we get out of here?
Yeah. Well, I just in terms of like I'd mentioned like the Knicks just have not, as a franchise, had a lot of these like elite wing defenders. To have two of them is going to be great. And just to see like October 6th, to see Bridges, assuming he plays like in a Knicks uniform, and see like where the evolution is going to be on the offensive end, how they're going to use, what's their backup five going to look like, and how is it going to be Anunoby, Randall, like right off the bat as a small ball, like what kind of tricks is Tibbs going to have, all the new and fancy things, and the X's and O's creativity that he showed last year. Was that just based on Brunson, like getting him more looks, or is that going to like carry over and really tap into some of the more like interesting sets they ran last year? Like how much is that going to carry over? I think that's going to be something that we can probably get a little bit of an indication right off the bat come October 6th when they tip off preseason. But just, I'm super excited and doing these pods, like just as I mentioned to start, like helping me get through it and think about the Knicks and unique ways and how they stack up against other teams. And I think the takeaway is they stack up well against most teams on the defensive end. And I know that losing Hartenstein is going to be a blow and something they're going to have to figure out how to replace, but there's enough defensive talent, and it starts with Bridges, starts with Anunoby, to where this can still be a top 5 defensive unit. And I think the offense should be top 10. And then if you're in that boat, top 10 offense, top 5 defense, I think you can be right up there with the best teams in the NBA. So we'll see how that shakes out, but it's going to be a fun season.
Do I dare put you on the spot with an over under 53.5 wins for the Knicks?
Sure.
About it at all?
Yeah, I think I think you and John both said you guys both went over. No, John went under, right?
John went under.
He went under.
Under on the Knicks, over on the Nets. Right. Mr. Macri did.
It's close. I'll go over. I think 54, 55 is kind of where I had them before the year. So,
okay.
Yeah. I think they'll just by the sheer luck, a healthier year, knock on wood.
Listen, I'm knocking on my wood desk as we speak. Yes. So there you go. DJ Zullo, it is so great to talk basketball with you and to get your thoughts on the upcoming season, specifically this area. Thank you as always. You can follow him on Twitter or on social, I should say, at DJ Ace NBA. The film work you've been doing this off season has just been immaculate and second to none. So if you're into following intelligent basketball analysis, DJ Zullo is a must follow. The link to him to follow him on Twitter if you want to break from political discourse and me complaining about the Jets, just follow DJ Zullo, and that's exactly what you'll get. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to follow my Jets thoughts, since I talked to Mets about how we were excited about the Mets, and that still exists. What a ninth inning yesterday. You can follow me, Andrew J. Claudio _. But we'll see if football season continues this week. And then, of course, follow Knicks Film School on all of our social platforms. We got a lot of good content coming up for the upcoming season. As far as this show is concerned, if you dug it, head to iTunes, drop a 5-star rating and a review. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, tell your friends. You know what to do. Get the word out. And until next time, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Let's go Knicks. And I will speak with you soon.